Why is it so darn hard to get started? Have you ever noticed just how often there are things that we want to do in life, and yet we just can't seem to muster up the motivation to actually take action and get going in whatever direction it is we want to take? And this doesn't just relate to health and weight loss, but to so many other areas of our lives. We get stuck. And even though we know we're stuck and we wish we weren't stuck, we just can't seem to manage to get unstuck. So where does that motivation to get going actually come from? And how can we tap into it a little more? Well, that's exactly what we're talking about in today's episode. And no matter what area of your life you're feeling stuck right now, my hope is that this one is going to give you the little push you need to finally start taking some real action towards your goals. Welcome to the Ditch the Carbs podcast, brought to you by Thinlicious. I'm your host, Ruth Soukup, and here we'll talk about everything from the science of weight loss and metabolic flexibility to practical tips for making your health a priority in the midst of a very busy life. It's the perfect blend of insightful education, practical application, and good old-fashioned motivation. So buckle up, friend, because it's about to get real. Hey there, and welcome back to the Ditch the Carbs podcast. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Ruth Soukup, and I am the founder of Thinlicious and the creator of the Thin Adapted System, as well as the New York Times bestselling author of 7 books, as well as what I would call a health enthusiast. Because after struggling with my weight and my health for a very long time, literally years, I finally decided to start doing my own research to start to figure out kind of the underlying reasons for why I was gaining weight in the first place and how I could do things differently. And ultimately, that's how I ended up creating the Thin Adapted System, which is the same system I used to lose 40 pounds and keep it off, and the system that has now helped thousands of women do the same. And if this is your first time listening to the Ditch the Carbs podcast, then I'm just going to warn you right now that I get pretty fired up about all of this stuff. Honestly, just mostly because I know how life-changing it can be. I am on a mission to change the world through helping women improve their health because it literally is the foundation of everything else that we do. If you don't have your health, you don't have anything. And not only that, it makes me crazy that so much of what we've been told about what is healthy over the past 50 or 100 years is flat out wrong. Just not even a little bit wrong, but dangerously, devastatingly wrong. And we are seeing the effects in our society with more people than ever who are unhealthy and overweight, with skyrocketing levels of heart disease and cancer and Alzheimer's and type 2 diabetes and all these other super preventable diseases that can be directly attributed to this pack of lies that we have all been told for so long. And if you want to understand more about all of these lies that we've been told and why they're so dangerous and how they've been keeping you sick and fat and unhealthy, then please know that I have actually put together a new in-depth, on-demand training video that you can go and watch for free called How to Lose Weight and Get Healthy for Life Without Dieting, Drugs, or Making Yourself Miserable. And I'm going to tell you right now that this video, it's really good. It's meaty. When I say it's in depth, I mean it's in depth. So it's a little bit of a time investment, but it is totally worth the watch because it will seriously reframe the way that you approach your health. It really is so eye-opening. And if this is an area of your life where you've been struggling, I promise it will be super helpful for you. And you can watch it. Again, it's absolutely free. Just my gift to you for being a listener of this podcast. All you have to do to access it is go to thinlicious.com/video. So once again, the URL for that training is thinlicious.com/video. So definitely don't miss that. And yet, one thing that I'm noticing is that even when we start to learn the truth about what's actually going on with the health and weight loss industry, even when we start to actually realize the scary truth, and it is scary, that the food and drug companies that have been dictating all of this so-called expert advice for the past 50, 75, 100 years, that they don't actually have our best interests at heart. And they're actually making billions and billions of dollars by keeping us fat and sick. And that even when our eyes start to open and we actually start to see the truth of what's really happening. And I talked about this just last week on this podcast, that our doctors have been bought and paid for, that the agencies that are supposed to be protecting us, like the American Heart Association and the American Diabetes Association, they're actively working against us. The things that should make us so angry and outraged that we literally take to the streets and protest, we don't do anything. We don't take action. We just sit there and we keep doing the same things that we've always done, even when we know. Right? Even when we hear this stuff, we just don't do anything. Maybe because it's easier, or maybe because it's comfortable, or maybe because it's what we know, or maybe because change feels too hard, or maybe because we've bought into the lies, or maybe because we don't want to believe that the lies could actually be true and that we've been duped. Mark Twain talked about that one time. He said, famously, it's easier to fool someone again than to convince them that they've been fooled. And then he pointed out that the truth cannot compete with someone who's determined to believe the lie. And that's why today I wanted to unpack that a little bit more. Not the lies themselves, because like I said, I just put together a whole training video for you that walks you through them in detail. And honestly, if you've been listening to this podcast for a while, even if you listened last week, you know that we've spent a lot of time talking about the truth of what's actually keeping us sick and fat and unhealthy and what you can do about it. But what if you've watched the training, or you've been listening to this podcast for a little while now, or you've been a part of our Thinlicious Facebook community, and you're starting to the point now where you're like dipping the toes in the water. You're kind of starting to like, okay, I get it. I think I understand what's happening, but you're still struggling to really take action on what you've learned. What if you're willing to accept the premise that what you're currently doing clearly isn't working, or that all the things that you've tried in the past haven't worked, and yet you still can't seem to find the motivation to make the necessary changes to actually get what you want? Or what if it's not even necessarily in the arena of health and weight loss that you feel stuck right now? What if it's some other area of your life that you know you should be making changes to or taking action on, and sometimes you think about it and yet you just can't seem to pull the trigger or get going? That there's something there that's giving you all this resistance. So what if it's, say, trying to get out of a dead-end job that you hate? What if it's trying to start a business of your own? What if it's trying to clear the clutter and organize your home? What if it's trying to get your finances in order? What if it's wanting to move to a different city? What if it's needing to get out of a toxic relationship? What if it's just wanting to find more joy and purpose in your life right now and being intentional about that? Why is it so hard to just get started? Why is it so scary to commit to change? And what can you actually do about it? Well, honestly, I think that it starts with understanding exactly what mental barriers are holding us back and making us so resistant to change in the first place. Before you can dig deep to find that inner motivation, you have to get real with yourself about those deep underlying fears that are actually keeping you stuck and making it hard to move forward. You have to understand yourself. And this is something that I have spoken about for a very long time, right? I wrote about it in depth in my book, Do It Scared. In fact, for that book, as I was writing that book, I did a huge 2-year research study where I surveyed more than 4,000 people on the role of fear in their lives and how it holds them back from pursuing their goals. And so through that study, I came away with a huge understanding of fear and the way that fear manifests for each of us, how our fear archetypes, as I call them, how for each of us, our fear archetypes are a little bit different. And when you can start to understand your specific fear archetype a little bit more, how fear is showing up in your life and where it tends to hold you back specifically, that's when I think that you can also start to understand how to handle it better and not let it stand in your way. Because ultimately, knowledge is power, right? Knowledge is power. And what I've learned is that the more you can understand what's actually going on inside your own brain, just like the more you can understand what's happening inside your own body, the less you have to allow yourself to just be controlled by emotion and how you feel at any given moment. Because we don't always have control over the emotions that come in waves, right? They just come sometimes and happen. But you don't have to be controlled by those emotions, especially when you understand what's behind them and what's going on. That's when you can start to take ownership of your own thought process. But if you don't actually know what's happening inside your head, then it all feels very out of control, right? It feels totally automatic and subconscious and like just something that you have absolutely no control over what's going to happen. But that's not actually true. You do have control over it, but it starts, like I said, it starts with understanding where you're at. So let's talk first as we dive into this. Let's talk first about some of the most common fear archetypes. And actually, let's just go through all the, why do the most common ones? Let's do all 7 archetypes and how they manifest, but specifically with this idea of health and weight loss in mind, because it's interesting. I've been talking about the fear archetypes for years. I wrote a whole book about it. But now in light of, what I'm doing and what we've started with Thinlicious, it's really interesting to go back to these fear archetypes and think of them in that context, because I think it really does. It's amazing how it manifests itself in different ways. And I will say, just having worked with now thousands of clients through Thinlicious, I see all of these different types of fear archetypes playing out. So let's talk about them. Number 1 is the procrastinator fear archetype, which is also known as the perfectionist, but we don't call it the perfectionist because some people take pride in that perfectionist label. And so we want to make sure that you know that this is how fear is manifesting itself. And what really happens is that perfectionism leads to procrastination. And so it's the procrastinator archetype. And if you're a perfectionist, you probably already know that about yourself, right? And like I said, you might even see that as a source of pride, not even realizing that all those perfectionist tendencies are often a form of fear because you use your need for everything to be perfect as a reason to not do it at all, hence the procrastination. So if you are the procrastinator, you are a person who typically spends a lot of time doing research, right? A lot of time getting organized, a lot of time getting things set up, and you probably find yourself stalling and finding other things to do rather than that one thing that you really should be doing, right? You're the one that's likely done all the research and read all the diet books and listened to all the podcasts because reading and listening feels safer than actually starting. But the problem is that you just never quite feel ready. But what you're really afraid of deep down is this fear of making a mistake, which is why it's so hard for you to get going because you're so afraid of getting it wrong. Because now you're overwhelmed with information overload because you've been doing all the research. And now the fear becomes even stronger because what if you make the wrong choice, or worse, what if you fail, right? It's just easier not to begin. And you should know that this fear archetype, the procrastinator / perfectionist, is actually the most common of all the fear archetypes. About a little less than 40% of the population, between 35 and 40% of the population have this archetype as their primary archetype. So if this is you, you are definitely not alone. But next up, the next most common fear archetype is the people pleaser. And for the people pleaser, the fear that holds you back is not necessarily the fear of making a mistake, but the fear of being judged or letting people down, because you care a lot about what other people think of you. And so sometimes that can mean that you even struggle with boundaries or saying no. And if you're a people pleaser, this may be affecting your health and weight loss journey in a number of different ways, right? For one, you might feel embarrassed or ashamed of what other people think of you if you start another new diet or another new weight loss program, right? There's this like, oh, I can't do this again because everybody would judge me and I don't want to tell anybody, right? Or maybe you're worried that you'll be judged for following a plan that so many people often because of all those lies that we've been told for so long about what's healthy and what's not. So many people have this kind of negative connotation that goes along with a low carb lifestyle, right? We've seen that a lot. I've seen that a lot with my clients. Friends and family get really judgy when they perceive something as being outside of the norm. Maybe you're feeling really judgy about it. And it can be hard, especially if you're a people pleaser. It's really hard to get past that when it feels like you're being judged for the lifestyle that you're choosing. Or maybe because you're a people pleaser, you just can't make it past those social situations when you're with other people and there's temptations and you're facing that peer pressure to indulge in all the things that basically got you to where you are right now in the first place. But it's just too hard to say no. And maybe you do okay on your own or you feel committed, but that second you're in that social situation, it feels impossible to stand up for yourself because you don't want to hurt anybody's feelings. You don't want to make anybody mad. You don't want to rock the boat. And so, every time you get in that situation, you fall off the wagon. And it might not seem like this is a fear that's holding you back, but it is often in a really, really big way. So that's the people pleaser. But there's more. Maybe the next one is the rule follower archetype. So maybe you're a rule follower. It's the third most common. So a lot of you listening to this probably are. But if you're a rule follower, it means for you that there's almost always a process that needs to be followed. Like it makes you very uncomfortable to stray from that path. You're very kind of black and white. And you don't like to step outside the lines. You don't even like other people to step outside the lines, right? You're the person who always reads the instruction manual from start to finish. If you're cooking a recipe, you're following it to the letters. And the good news for a rule follower is actually that if you are given the right set of rules and instructions to follow, if the rule book and the playbook is a good one, you will most likely excel. Right. And I have actually found that in all of my programs. I find that many of my most successful clients and students are actually rule followers because they're the ones that do the work. They complete all their assignments. They follow everything. They follow the path and they do great. But the problem, I think, for rule followers, especially when it comes to modern health and weight loss, is that so many of the rules, right? I'm putting those in air quotes right now, even though you can't see me. So many of the rules that we've been given are total BS. For all these years, we've been told all these things like if you want to lose weight, you need to eat less and exercise more, and you just need to count your calories, and you need to eat less fat and eat more whole grains. And so you're following all the rules, but they're the wrong rules. And yet you can't let them go because it's what your doctor keeps saying and all the experts keep saying. And there's this fear of breaking out of that conventional wisdom and going against what you perceive as the right way to do things. That's absolutely holding you back. So that is the rule follower. And then there is the outcast. And if you're an outcast, then I can definitely relate because that is my number one fear archetype as well. But if you're an outcast like me, then your biggest fear is typically the fear of being rejected. And that might sound a little bit similar to the people pleaser's fear of being judged or not being liked. But the way that it manifests for an outcast is actually very different than for a people pleaser. You see, outcasts tend to manifest that deep fear of rejection by rejecting other people and other ideas first, right? We reject before we can be rejected. And it's almost like this preemptive strike or protection mechanism or something like that. And so on the surface for outcasts, it can kind of seem like outcasts just don't care, right? Like we don't care what other people think. But that's not true. We actually care very deeply. And so rejecting the world or people or things that might work for us, right? These ideas, it means not having to face that pain of the rejection. It's way easier to say something like, oh, keto's dumb. Everybody's doing it. It's just another fad diet that's not going to work for me, than actually risk taking action and and then having it not actually change the deeper issues that are causing your unhappiness, right? It feels like too much of a risk. We reject anything that's a risk, anything that would make us feel vulnerable, anything that would require us to put ourselves out there in some way. So definitely you can see how that would hold you back when it comes to anything but health and weight loss as well. So that is the outcast. And then there is the self-doubter fear archetype. And it's not hard to see how being a self-doubter could keep you stuck in many ways, right? Just the name alone is kind of like, oh, yep, that's me. I hear a lot of people, yep, definitely that's me. But especially when it comes to health and weight loss, because if you're a self-doubter, you're already struggling with this deep feeling of insecurity and a fear of not being good enough, right? And that can just be compounded when you know that you are overweight or struggling with your weight, or if you've gained weight and you had never had it before, right? You're already struggling with insecurity. And then that's just adding fuel to the fire. So a lot of times if you are a self-doubter, you will have trouble believing that you are actually capable of making real and positive changes in your life. And that can make it really, really hard to find any motivation to get started. Because as a self-doubter, you're probably the person who would never in a million years dream of taking a before picture and sharing it in the Facebook group, right? That would be like your worst nightmare, because your self-criticism in that moment would just be off the charts. But you might also, as a self-doubter, find yourself feeling critical of the people who do that, right? The people who actually dare to post a before picture, because there's like this tendency, because of your own insecurities, you have a tendency to criticize other people. And often that tendency to be super critical can put a strain on your relationships, because the people around you feel like you're always picking on them. So if you're listening to this and you're like, oh yeah, that does affect my relationships. I am overly critical of people around me. It could be that you are a self-doubter. But often that criticism, right, where it really stems from is that deep feeling of insecurity, not being enough, that's just weighing on you all the time. So that is the self-doubter. Then there is the excuse maker fear archetype. And we can probably all just right off the bat think of at least one person we know who fits this description, right? But basically the excuse maker always has an excuse, a reason for why they can't get started, or in the case of health and weight loss, an excuse for why they've gained weight and why nothing you try will actually work for you. Maybe it's a thyroid issue. Maybe it's hormones. Maybe it's genetics. Maybe it's the fact that you don't have time, or you have food sensitivities. Maybe it's type 2 diabetes or autoimmune or arthritis, or you're too old, or your husband doesn't support you, or you travel too much, or because there's always an excuse. And for the excuse maker, this deep underlying fear is actually the fear of taking responsibility or the fear of being blamed. And sometimes this goes all the way back to like childhood trauma, right? Parents that constantly blamed you for things, but it's almost this visceral, panicked reaction to the idea of having to take ownership for your own life and your own things and your own health. And so it keeps you stuck in excuse land where you never have to take the blame for how things have turned out. But at the end of the day, even a good excuse is still an excuse. And so that is the excuse maker, where that's really the thing that's holding you back. Because you could have the best excuse in the world, but it wouldn't matter because it's still keeping you stuck. So that's the excuse maker. And then finally, there is the pessimist fear archetype. And the pessimist fear archetype is a little bit different than all the other ones, because it's the one that's most likely to be kind of a temporary thing. But the pessimist fear archetype happens if you've experienced a lot of hardship and adversity in your life, or maybe if you're currently going through a particularly hard season where you've had some really big challenges or setbacks or trauma, like a divorce or a job loss or the death of somebody close to you, some like really hard stuff. You might get to a place where you're identifying as a pessimist. And what happens when you get into pessimist mode is that basically your biggest fear becomes experiencing more pain and adversity. Like you just can't handle anything else. And so for you at this moment, every opportunity feels too risky. It's almost like you just completely shut down and you're reluctant to try because everything in life, like it feels just like an opportunity to get hurt again. So in essence, you've almost given up. And so not surprisingly, of all the 7 archetypes, this is probably the hardest fear to work through and to get past as you're, working on trying to find more motivation, just because you're in such a dark place. That said, it is also the one that is most likely to be temporary, right? Sometimes we just go through these hard seasons and we have to work our way through the grief or the pain or whatever, and we can move out of them and things get better. So that is the pessimist archetype. So there you have it, the seven fear archetypes across. Gosh, I don't even know how many people have taken our assessment so far. I think over 100,000 test takers so far. There's the procrastinator, the people pleaser, the rule follower, the outcast, the self-doubter, the excuse maker, and the pessimist. And I do need to say this. If multiple archetypes resonated with you, right? If you're like, well, that sounded like me, but that one sounded a little bit like me, and that one did too, right? That's actually totally normal. Everybody has a little bit of all of them in there, right? No one is all procrastinator or all self-doubter. Instead, there's really a sliding scale for each one. And so your sort of combination of sliding scales, it all works together to form your unique fear fingerprint. So you could have one archetype that's super dominant. Like for me, my outcast is far more dominant than any of my other. But you could also have several that score for you. You could be a procrastinator and a people pleaser and a rule follower all at the same time. But the higher your score for any particular archetype, the more likely it is that that particular archetype is having a bigger impact in your life. So, if you score high in multiple areas, it means you've got a lot of fear because it's holding you back in multiple different ways. And if I will say this too, if you actually want to take the fear assessment to determine your fear archetype, you can go to doitscared.com. We have it there. We have a free version, and then there's a paid version that will give you more information, but you can find out your top fear archetype with the free version. So it's pretty interesting. So again, you can go get that at doitscared.com. But when it comes to any of this, right, the important thing to know, I think, and especially when we're talking about motivation, the important thing to know is that you can actually do something about this, right? Your fear, however it is currently manifesting in your life, it doesn't have to hold you back. All that matters is that you identify it. Again, because all of this fear that I just talked about, it's all happening subconsciously beneath the surface. It's happening whether you realize it's happening or not. And so when you don't realize that it's happening, when you don't really see what's going on, or even realize that certain behaviors are actually your fear manifesting itself in very real and destructive ways, then it just feels totally out of control. But as soon as you can start to identify those patterns of behavior in your own life, as soon as you start to see them, right? As soon as you know about them, that's when you can start to see them. And when you can see them, that's when you can start to change them. What was subconscious becomes conscious, and you actually notice it. And what's more is that as you notice it, you begin to realize that you have the power to choose something different, that fear doesn't have to control you. And that's where the mindset shift begins to happen, because instead of letting it all happen and being dominated by your emotions and by this fear that's just happening and being subconsciously controlled by it, you start to see how you can use it as a tool for growth, because we all have these unique fingerprints. And I think it's important to know too that even though there are downsides to them, that there's also strengths that are involved in them, right? The reality is that each fear archetype is kind of a double-edged sword. There's a part of it that holds you back and that may be keeping you stuck, but each fear archetype also has strengths associated with it. So if you're a procrastinator, then you're afraid of making a mistake. Yeah, but you also tend to have an amazing attention to detail, and you're probably super meticulous and super organized. Or if you're a people pleaser, yes, you do tend to seek approval too much, but you're also typically a great person to be around, right? You're thoughtful, you're well-liked, you're fun. If you're a rule follower, yeah, you can get stuck in black and white thinking and maybe be a little too rigid sometimes, but you're also incredibly diligent and responsible. If you're an outcast, you might fear rejection, but most of the time you're probably an independent thinker and you probably have a lot of drive. Or if you're a self-doubter, you might struggle with insecurity on the one hand, but you're also incredibly empathetic. And so by understanding your own fear archetype, you can actually start to use it as a fuel to reach your goals instead of letting it keep you stuck. And that mindset shift in and of itself can be incredibly motivating. But do you want to know what I see as basically the universal antidote to overcoming fear, regardless of how any particular fear is showing up in your life right now? Like, this is my answer. This is my answer. You ready for it? This is like the one thing you got to hear from this episode. It's action. Action is the antidote to fear. It is that simple. You have to actually do something. You've got to take a step in the right direction, any step, even the smallest step, but then take the next small step and the next one. And let each small action that you take propel you on to the next one and keep moving forward. Because at the end of the day, courage is a muscle that you have to exercise. You can't start lifting weights and think that you're going to bench press 300 pounds on day one, right? Like, that would be crazy to do that. You have to start slow and build. You've got to build that muscle, and your courage and your motivation is the exact same way. So often I think our fear comes because we think that we have to change everything all at once. And so that feels super scary and super unknown and like, oh, I don't know if I can do this. But, and I say this all the time, big goals never happen all at once. They are only the result of small steps taken consistently over time. So when it comes to improving your health or losing weight, and really when it comes to achieving any sort of big goal in your life, what are the small action steps that you can take? And what are they? Like, I'm truly asking you because, I mean, you're already listening to this podcast, so that's a really good start, right? Yay for you. That's a first small step. And honestly, there are lots of really great podcasts out there on pretty much any topic that you could care to learn about. And so that is a really, really, really fantastic first step. But if all you do is listen without ever taking more action, that same fear is going to keep holding you back. So you got to take the next step and the next step after that. So let's talk more about what some of those steps can be. Well, in the case of health and weight loss, if you haven't watched that free on-demand training video that I mentioned at the beginning of this episode, then that should be your next step. Seriously, guys, shameless plug here, but it's really good and it's really eye-opening. And that will definitely help put you on the right path. If you need the URL again, you can find it at thinlicious.com/video. But for any goal that you want to accomplish, I think it's super, super important that you find a way to take concrete action beyond just listening and learning. Content is cheap, guys. Content is cheap. And so while I do believe that knowledge is power, it is only powerful when paired with action. You have to actually apply what you are learning in real time and test it out. And that means that if you want to get serious about your health, start by reading every single food label to see what's actually in the food that you are eating. How much sugar and carbohydrate are you actually consuming on a daily basis? What are the ingredients? What effect are those ingredients having on your body? Simply starting to pay attention and becoming mindful of what you're currently eating is the smallest, simplest step that you could possibly take, but it's something, right? It's a real thing, and it can lead you to the next step. But when it comes to taking concrete action, do you want to know what I think is such an important mindset shifter for any goal that you want to accomplish in life? It is actually investing in yourself in some way. And this is so huge Because we as humans are weird, right? The minute we get something for free, we do not value it. We do not take it seriously. It instantly becomes something we totally take for granted. I mean, think about a college student whose parents pay for everything versus that college student who is working their way through school to pay for it themselves. Which one of those two values their education and which one spends 4 years doing cake stands at frat parties, right? I mean, we see it all the time. I have 2 teenagers, so I honestly deal with this literally on the daily. If you have 2 teenagers, you know what I'm talking about. My girls have zero problem spending my money. And honestly, they don't seem to value anything that I pay for. When I pay for it, they just take it for granted. And yet the minute it is their money that they're spending, they are suddenly taking it way more seriously and spending it way more carefully. But the same goes for all of us, right? My teenage girls are not unique in this way. It is human nature. And so that means that if you really, really, really want to get serious about motivating yourself and you really want to make a mental shift in any area of your life, then the very best thing that you can do is find a way to put your money where your mouth is. Invest in yourself and the things that you really want. So you want to leave your dead-end job? Go back to school or invest in a career coach. You want to start a business? Take a real risk, right? Take a real risk. Don't just think about it. Actually put some money down. Go rent a space. Go buy some inventory. Don't just keep talking about it. Let me tell you, nothing's more motivating than when you've got money on the line. You want to improve your relationships or improve your mindset? Invest in life coaching or invest in therapy. You want to be more organized? Take a time management course or invest in a professional organizer or go buy yourself the most expensive closet organization system you can, right? Like do something to invest in it. And you want to improve your health? Find a way to invest in yourself in a way that actually costs you. And for everybody that bar is different, right? What is a huge investment for some people might not be a huge investment for someone else, but you have to feel it. So whatever hurts a little bit for you, that's what's going to force you to take it seriously. But don't spend your life hanging out in the cheap seats, telling yourself you can't afford it, because I promise you that whatever you're spending your money on right now is determining what you actually value, whether you realize it or not. And that might sound harsh, but I tell you what, the older I get, or maybe the older my kids get, or the more teenagey they get, the more I realize how much it's true. We value what we pay for. And honestly, I could probably keep going with a million stories of how this has played out in my life and how I've seen it, but I've probably ranted long enough and I'm already well over time. So I will just wrap this episode up by saying this. There is no substitute for taking action. Thinking about it is an action. Just listening is an action. Talking about it is an action. If you actually want it, you have to find a way to start with concrete action. One small step, even a tiny step, but a step that will get you closer. So that's my challenge for you today. What is one small thing you could do differently starting right now? One tiny action that you could take today. Then take it. Build that courage muscle one tiny step at a time. And I will say this too. If you are currently in our Thinlicious Facebook community, let's start a conversation about this. I would love to hear your thoughts on this episode. I would love to hear what is your fear archetype and how has that been playing out in your health and weight loss journey? And what is the small action step that you are committing to take? And if this was helpful to you or it was eye-opening or whatever, and there is someone in your life who you think could benefit from hearing this too, please share it with them. I said this at the beginning of the episode, but I really, really do. Like, my mission in life is to change the world by helping people transform their health. And I am so committed to doing everything in my power to spread the word. So send them the link in a text, share it on social, share it by email, wherever, but don't keep it to yourself, please. This is too important. Our health is too important. And then be sure to hit that subscribe or follow button on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever you like to listen so you can always be notified of new episodes. And that is all for now. I will see you very soon.